The CBC's Evan Dyer is in our Ottawa bureau with more on this story. So, Evan, tell us a bit more about what Trudeau said in that interview.
Well, a lot of the interview was focused on the detainees issues, which, as any Canadian official will tell you, is the #1 issue between China and Canada and has been for the past year as well. When it came to talk about things like free trade and business, Prime Minister Trudeau made it pretty clear that any progress on any of those fronts are conditioned on what happens on the other one. And his language, his tone about China, while still fairly mild compared to the way China speaks about Canada, was perhaps a little harsher than some other members of his government. In fact, he was specifically asked about a comment by his defense minister that China is not an adversary of Canada. And of course, the defense minister was saying it's not a military adversary. And Trudeau said it is an adversary, or behaving like an adversary in some respects, referring, of course, to these detentions. And he did seem to pretty much rule out the prospect of any kind of a free trade deal. And of course, Canada is proceeding with a free trade arrangement, which we're already part of, which deliberately excludes China. So perhaps not that surprising to hear those comments.
Now, we said in the intro that China is reacting angrily. Tell us a bit more about that.
Right, not clear if they were reacting angrily to those comments by the Prime Minister or to something else. In fact, there's something in their comments that might lead one to think that it's about an agreement that Canada signed yesterday. So let's look, first of all, at what the Foreign Ministry spokesperson Geng Shuang said. Indeed, the language is harsher than what we've heard in the past. He said, "I wonder if Canada is too heartbroken for tears. If you pull chestnuts out of the fire for others, you will end up being the one getting burned. Here's some advice to the Canadian side. Ganging up on China by forming cliques or by linking China with some other issues will be a waste of time and is doomed to fail." So fairly dramatic language there from Geng Shuang. And the phrase forming cliques is an interesting one, Diane, because Canada did sign yesterday a memorandum of understanding with the United States, joining what is essentially a clique of 10 countries that have agreed to try to counter the Chinese monopoly on rare earth minerals, the kind of thing that we're looking at there. These minerals are being mined in various countries around the world, some of which are joining this clique, I think the Chinese refer to it as, which is a group that brings together countries like Australia, Argentina, Brazil, Congo, and the US and Canada to try to ensure that they will have access to these very important minerals in the future. And the reason that they are so important is because they include things like tantalum, lithium, the kind of materials that are needed to make the most modern technologies like electric car batteries, cell phones, microprocessors, and so on. Right now, China has a worrying stranglehold, if you like, on that market. And in fact, earlier this year, we interviewed the Japanese ambassador about Japan's difficulties when some of its citizens were held prisoner in China for an extended period. And during that conflict, in fact, the Chinese did cut off the trade in rare earth minerals to Japan, causing some major pain to Japanese industry and forcing the Japanese to look for other sources. And it appears that Canada and the US are doing the same, partly in response to hints by China that it might bring rare earth minerals into its trade dispute with the United States, that it might use them to try to get leverage. And on another front, China was also pushing back pretty hard on Canada in recent days, with the Chinese consulate in Vancouver, according to a report by the Vancouver Sun, looking to recruit Chinese Canadians into what it calls a volunteer corps who would defend the rights of Chinese citizens in Canada, where it says incidents of injury, illness, disappearance, detention, fraud, and so forth remain frequent. And it said that the role of these citizens would be to construct a system for overseas Chinese peace. And we know that some Canadian citizens do appear to have traveled to Beijing to take part in training and receive diplomas, and now as volunteers of that Chinese embassy or Chinese consulate volunteer corps.